The Revvl line is like the modern version of the MyTouch. You know, the phones that were made by HTC, LG, and Huawei, kind of like the Nexus line actually. But the Revvl line took over, being made by Alcatel or TCL and sometimes Motorola. More recently, a company called WingTech has been making these budget phones for T-Mobile and Metro, even though it carries the T-Mobile logo on the back. This is currently what they sell and don't sell for some reason, and in the used market, there's not too much, but they're around $100 plus. But is that even a good price for the T-Mobile Revvl 7? Now let's get this over because on paper, this is an awesome phone, kind of, but in reality, it's not. See, this phone has a wonderful 120Hz OLED panel for the screen, only it doesn't. For some reason, GSM Arena and maybe others will mix up the spec with the Revvl 7 Pro, which does have an OLED panel, but even on Amazon it says that the Revvl 5G has an OLED screen, which is definitely not true at all. And websites like Phone Arena don't even have the specs for this phone, but do for previous Revvls. This phone really gets no love, as half of the searches are for the Revvl 7 Pro. Actually trying to find this phone can be a challenge in itself. Either way, this actually has a 6.52-inch 1080p 120Hz LCD display, which looks terrible. Blue light filter makes a bad screen horrible, but the quality you get from watching YouTube videos just feels like a budget phone from 2010, even with the blue light blocking off. I can buy an LG G7 screen for $11, and this one is $23. So you can't really say, oh, it's just a budget phone, when cheaper screens look so much better. Another example is the 2021 Motorola Edge screen is $19, while the OLED Motorola Edge 30 Ultra is $25, both being great 144Hz phones with, like I said, one of them being an OLED. All that said, the 120Hz definitely makes the phone feel fast enough. There's no shortage of bezel and chin on this phone, being the worst that I've seen in quite a while. I will say that while using gestures, the touch sensitivity is hit or miss, but feels like the phone just kind of forgets at times. At least we get double tap to wake. There's no double tap to sleep or always on display though, the latter which makes sense because of the LCD panel. As for the outside of the phone, not too great. This glass front phone has a plastic back that tries to feel premium but definitely fails. This wouldn't be a budget phone without some pointless cameras and one actual camera as well as a flashlight. Then the mid-frame is clearly plastic with the top having a microphone. The left side is where the SIM and SD card tray is, while the right side has the volume buttons and a power button that not only has a fingerprint reader in it, but is also magenta, just like T-Mobile. The bottom is where the budget staple is, the headset jack. While there is another microphone, the USB 2.0 port that maxes out at 15 watts of wired charging with no wireless charging, and a loudspeaker that surprisingly pairs with the top earpiece for a dual speaker setup, but it sounds terrible and does not give proper stereo feel at all. Moving to the inside, we get the 5000 mAh battery that seems to last forever. I will say that like the OnePlus Nord N30, the battery life is crazy good on this phone. Then we have the processor, the Snapdragon 6 Gen 1, which is very similar to the Snapdragon 855, but this chip allows for 5G support, but performance falls flat. You'll notice that the operating system isn't the most stable and snappiest forever, not being unusable, but it does feel like Android 14 is not made for this phone. Yes, it runs Android 14, and yes, the last security patch was from September 2024, and here's what it's at now at the time of recording, so don't look forward to Android 15 anytime soon. And I'm not even going to say the next Android version because that's definitely not going to happen. With 6GB of RAM and 128GB of built-in storage, it is surprisingly decent for normal apps, but gaming is where it truly falls apart. We're talking 25 to 50% worse than what the 855 chip does GPU-wise, while the CPU is similar and maybe 5 to 10% worse depending on what you're doing. Other specs are, yes, 5G support, no Wi-Fi 6, just Wi-Fi 2.4 and 5 GHz, and we have Bluetooth 5.1 with NFC support. This 6.59-inch tall phone sounds kinda heavy at 206 grams, but feels somewhat light because of that plastic build. And in case you're wondering, yes, the vibrating motor is miserable. Now, I don't get companies that do this. On paper, this is a $149 phone with a 50 megapixel camera and an 8 megapixel front camera, which would have been fine to leave it at that. And surprisingly, the shots are actually okay. The 8 megapixel camera leaves you wanting more, and like the screen, feels like a phone from 2010. It captures 1080p 30 frames per second video, which is what you would expect. Of course, not 4K, because budget phone. Video is worse than the stills that it takes, but the rear camera is actually what you want to use. There's a 2 megapixel depth camera and 2 megapixel macro camera, but I don't know if you actually want to take portraits with this phone, and the macro camera is nowhere near what the main camera does. The main camera is a 50 megapixel sensor, which, like most phones, looks usable at the 12.6 megapixel shot that it bends down to, while the 50 megapixel shots aren't that great. This is actually weird because in a full frame or medium format camera, having 50 to 100 megapixels is actually great for photography, just terrible for video. Similar to that, the video on this is not great, but going with 2K 30 frames per second is a strange option and reminds me of the Samsung S8, which allowed for 2K recording as well. The video is better than the front camera, but it's definitely not great, as expected. There's nothing amazing about this camera set, but the shots that the main produces don't feel like a 2010 phone, maybe 2017? Similar to the Samsung A14 5G, it's not great, but also fairly usable. Now these videos kind of seem pointless because yeah, it's a budget phone, it's gonna be bad. But people don't understand that. You might, or maybe even you don't. A decent amount of people believe that every phone that's being sold should be average or better, and that's simply not true. Pricing matters when it comes to explaining if a product is good or not, but there are some outliers. For example, I just got the $3,899 Sony FX3, which has the same sensor as the $3,599 Sony A7S III, and the $2,199 Sony ZVE1. Literally the same sensor, but a $1,700 price difference. Phones are great at somewhere around $500 to $700 and higher. I don't know exactly what that baseline is, but when you spend less than that, you'll get bad phones that will eventually just become worse than you think that they are. There are some exceptions, like the Nothing Phone 1 is an amazing phone at the $299 that it was in the US. But for the most part, $600 plus will get you a phone that is meant to last. I'm not saying that this phone won't last, but it's kind of like food. It's very difficult to spend $7 and get great food and a drink for lunch, but I did that the other day at Costco. What I'm saying is that I know I'm not meant for budget phones, but there are two things to think about. One, this wasn't a miserable experience, just a clunky feeling one that I wouldn't want to live for multiple years. And two, do we actually need these budget phones that are just waiting to become e-waste? At the end of the day, apparently T-Mobile no longer sells this phone within less than a year, and no sequel to replace it at the time of writing this video. It's hard to even find this type of video in the first place. It's questionable as to why you're even watching this video, and more importantly, why I'm even making this video. Really, I made this to say that for the price, buy something else used. I'm also here to say that if you got this phone for free, it definitely isn't the end of the world, especially if you're not used to a premium phone or secretly just want a flip phone. And that's my review of the T-Mobile Revvl 7. This phone just came to me as it's definitely not a phone I planned on reviewing, but I'm glad that I could have. It lets me know that budget phones aren't all terrible. But what do you think? Let me know, and as always, thanks for watching.